The wind had teeth, and it was chewing on the high peaks of the San Juan Mountains. Samuel Hawkins felt its bite through his buckskin jacket and the thick wool shirt beneath. It was a hungry wind, promising a blizzard that would choke the passes and bury the world in white. He pulled his hat down low, the brim stiff with ice, and leaned forward in the saddle, trying to shield his face. His breath plumed and froze in his beard. Below him, the pines groaned under the weight of a gathering storm, their scent sharp and clean in the frigid air. This was a language he understood. The mountains never lied. They told you when to hunt, when to shelter, and when to die. His horse, a sturdy buckskin named Buck, took another hesitant step and faltered, favoring his right foreleg. Samuel grunted, a sound of frustration swallowed by the wind. He swung down from the saddle, his boots sinking into the deepening snow. The horse stood still, head low, patient. Samuel ran a gloved hand down the animal's leg, feeling the heat and the slight swelling just above the hoof. A stone bruise, most likely, or a strained tendon from that last icy creek bed. Bad luck and bad timing. He looked west, toward the wall of gray cloud that was erasing the horizon. They would not make it over Wolf Creek Pass now, not with Buck lame and a storm like this moving in. The thought soured in his gut. Another 2 days, and he would have been in his winter cabin. The trap set, the solitude settling around him like a familiar blanket. Instead, his path was blocked by a lame horse and the will of the weather. There was only one choice. He had to turn back toward the noise and the smells and the people of Pine Ridge. He hated towns. They were mazes of false fronts and shifting rules, places where a man's worth was measured by the jingle in his pocket instead of the skill in his hands. In the high country, the rules were simple: stay warm, stay fed, stay watchful. A man knew where he stood with a grizzly or a blizzard. In town, the dangers wore hats and smiled while they sized you up. Still, Pine Ridge had a blacksmith in a livery. It had shelter. He had a pack full of prime beaver and marten pelts to trade. Survival was about taking the trail that was open, not the one you wished for. He shortened the reins and started walking, leading Buck slowly down the winding trail. The horse limped along behind him, a steady, unfortunate rhythm against the rising howl of the wind. Snow began to fall in earnest, not the gentle flakes of a passing squall, but the hard, stinging pellets that meant business. They clung to his eyelashes and melted on his cheeks. Each step was a small victory against the cold. The world was shrinking, the jagged peaks and vast canyons dissolving into a swirl of white and gray. All that existed was the man, the horse, and the pressing need to reach the town that squatted in the valley below like a necessary evil. It was near dusk when the first lights of Pine Ridge pricked the gloom. They were feeble yellow specks, promising warmth but also complications. The main street was a muddy track rutted by wagon wheels, now quickly turning white. A few figures hurried between the saloon and the general store, heads bent against the storm. The air, which moments ago smelled only of pine and snow, was now thick with the scent of coal smoke, frying bacon, and wet wool. Samuel wrinkled his nose. It was the smell of too many people crammed into too small a space. He led Buck straight to the livery. A boy, no older than 14, with a shock of red hair and a face full of freckles, came out of the warmth of the stables. He looked at the big mountain man and his limping horse with wide, curious eyes. "Can you see to him, son?" Samuel asked, his voice a low rumble. "He has gone lame, needs a warm stall and a good feed of oats. I will settle up in the morning." The boy nodded eagerly, taking the reins. "Yes, sir, mister. I will take good care of him. Looks like you got in just ahead of the worst of it." "That I did," Samuel said, pulling a few coins from a leather pouch. "This is for the trouble." He watched the boy lead Buck into the stable, his shoulders slumping a little. The horse was his only partner in the high country, a silent companion whose strength and sense of the trail had saved his skin more than once. Seeing him hurt felt like a part of himself was broken. With his heavy pack of furs slung over one shoulder, and his Hawken rifle in his other hand. He trudged through the snow toward the orange glow of the blacksmith's forge. The rhythmic clang of hammer on anvil was a steady heartbeat in the dying light, a sound of purpose and creation. He needed to see O'Rourke about a new set of traps and maybe trade a few pelts for supplies. The heat from the forge hit him like a physical blow as he pushed open the heavy wooden door. It was a welcome shock after the biting cold. Michael O'Rourke, a man built like one of his own anvils, with massive arms and a soot-stained beard, looked up from the wagon wheel he was hammering. He grinned, his teeth white in his grimy face. Samuel Hawkins, the wind blew in something more than just snow. I see. It blew in a lame horse, Samuel replied, dropping his pack to the dirt floor. I was hoping you might have some shot and powder, maybe some salt. O'Rourke gestured with his hammer toward the back of the forge. Help yourself. We can settle up after... The smith's gaze then flickered to the other man in the room, the one standing silently by the quenching barrel. Samuel had noticed him the moment he entered. You always noticed a man like that. He was Ute, tall and lean in fringed buckskins, his black hair in 2 long braids. There was no weapon in his hands, but he stood with the coiled stillness of a man who was never unarmed. His face was a mask of proud indifference, his dark eyes missing nothing. On the floor beside him lay a stack of glossy silver fox and wolf pelts. Traded, Samuel guessed, for the small sacks of supplies at his feet. Samuel gave the Ute warrior a slow nod. The nod was returned, just as slow, just as measured. There was no friendship in the gesture, but there was a deep, unspoken understanding. They were 2 sides of the same coin, men who lived by the land and its unforgiving laws. The town was a place they both had to endure, a trading post where they were viewed with a mixture of fear and suspicion. Samuel saw the patrolmen on the street earlier, their rifles held a little too ready, their eyes lingering on any face that was not white. He knew they were there to keep the Ute out of the valley, to enforce a treaty written on paper that meant nothing to the mountains themselves. The Ute warrior gathered his sacks of ammunition and salt. He was called Tava, a name that meant sun in his own tongue. He moved with a liquid grace, his moccasins making no sound on the hard-packed earth. As he passed Samuel, his eyes met the mountain man's for a brief, intense moment. There was a warning in that gaze, a quiet intensity that had nothing to do with Samuel himself and everything to do with the world they both inhabited. Then he was gone, slipping out the door and vanishing into the swirling snow as if he were a part of it. O'Rourke let out a low whistle, wiping sweat from his brow with the back of his arm. That one. He walks quiet. Tava. He comes. He trades. He goes. Does not say more than 10 words a season. Good man to have on your side in a fight, I would wager. Bad man to have against you. Samuel busied himself measuring out powder and shot, his movements economical. He preferred it that way. Words were like loose rocks on a steep trail. Too many of them could cause an avalanche. He trusted silence. He trusted what a man did, not what he said. Heard the news? Samuel, O'Rourke asked, his voice dropping as he leaned on his anvil. Big doings in Pine Ridge tonight, even with this blizzard trying to tear the sky apart. Samuel grunted, focused on his task. Town business is not my business. It is James Morrison's business, and that makes it the whole town's business. The blacksmith said, He is getting married tonight, in the church down the street. Samuel paused. He knew the name. Everyone knew the name. James Morrison ran the freighting company that supplied half the mining camps in the San Juans. His wagons and mules were everywhere. His name on contracts for the railroad that was pushing its way west, devouring land and spitting out tracks. Morrison was a man of influence, a man whose ambition was as vast as the territory itself. He was the kind of man Samuel made a point to avoid. Rich men in towns like this did not get rich by being fair. They got rich by taking... A wedding, Samuel said, a note of disbelief in his voice. In this storm, Who is foolish enough to be out on a night like this? O'Rourke shrugged his massive shoulders. The bride, I suppose, some woman from back east. They say, just arrived a few days ago. I guess when a man like Morrison decides he is getting married, not even God's own weather's going to stop him. Samuel finished gathering his supplies. The idea was strange. A celebration in the middle of a storm. It felt wrong. A challenge to the power of the mountains. It was the kind of arrogance that the high country had a way of punishing. He bundled his goods, added a few of his best beaver pelts to the pile for O'Rourke, and shouldered his pack. I will be at the boarding house, he told the blacksmith. If the pass clears. It will not clear before morning. O'Rourke called after him. Maybe not for 2 days. Stay warm. Mountain man. The wind tore at him as he stepped back onto the street. The snow was deeper now, piling in drifts against the buildings. He could barely see the saloon across the way, its windows foggy with light and noise. He ignored it. He was not looking for whiskey or company. He wanted a quiet room, a meal, and the anonymity of a stranger passing through. He made his way to a boarding house at the far end of the street. A plain, 2-story building run by a widow named Mrs. Gable. She gave him a room on the 2nd floor for 2 bits. A room that was small and cold, but had a bed and a window that looked out over the town. From his window, he could just make out the church, its steeple a dark finger pointing at the angry sky. A single, stubborn light glowed in its window, a beacon in the blizzard. He sat on the edge of the stiff bed, the Hawken leaning against the wall beside him. He could feel the exhaustion in his bones, the deep weariness of a man who had pushed himself and his animal to their limits. But sleep would not come. The town was too close, its sounds and smells seeping through the thin walls. He heard a fiddle start up in the saloon, a manic, cheerful tune that sounded tinny and desperate against the roar of the wind. He heard the heavy tread of boots on the boardwalk below, and he thought about the wedding. A rich man taking a bride in the heart of a storm. It felt like a story that had already started without him, a wheel turning in the dark. He had wanted nothing more than to pass through this place, a ghost from the mountains, unseen and untouched. But a lame horse had decided otherwise. Fate, or just dumb luck, had forced him to stop. For one night, he was a part of Pine Ridge, a witness to its little dramas. He did not like it. He did not like it at all. He pulled off his wet boots, the feeling of the cold floor a familiar discomfort. The wind howled at the window pane, and Samuel Hawkins, who was at home in the wildest places, felt like a stranger in a cage. The cold in the small room was a damp, creeping thing that seeped in through the window frame and the floorboards. Samuel lay on the thin mattress, fully clothed, listening to the storm. It was no longer just a wind with teeth. It was a beast, roaring and clawing at the flimsy wooden town. Sleep was impossible. The fiddle music from the saloon had long since been defeated by the blizzard, but the town's presence remained. A low hum of anxiety that vibrated right through him. He pushed himself off the bed and walked to the window, the floor groaning under his weight. He rubbed a clear circle on the frosted pane with the heel of his hand and looked out. The street below was a river of blowing snow, the drifts sculpted into strange, beautiful shapes against the dark buildings. The only light came from his own boarding house and the church directly across the way. Its windows were tall and narrow, glowing with a warm, steady candlelight that seemed both defiant and fragile in the face of the storm's fury. As he watched, the heavy oak doors of the church swung open. A wedge of golden light and the faint, muffled sound of an organ spilled out into the night. A few figures, huddled deep in thick coats, emerged first, battling the wind as they scurried away into the darkness. Then came the pastor, a small, round man holding his hat to his head, his words of congratulation lost to the gale. Next came the groom, James Morrison. Even from across the street, the man's presence was immense. He was broad-shouldered and tall, dressed in a fine black coat that the snow seemed hesitant to touch. He stood on the top step as if he owned the storm itself, his posture radiating an unshakable confidence. He turned and offered a hand to someone still inside the doorway. And then she appeared, the bride. She was a silhouette at first, framed by the light of the church. She wore a white dress, the fabric heavy and rich, and a veil that covered her face. She took Morrison's hand and stepped out onto the porch. For a moment, she paused, her head tilted as if listening to the storm. A sudden, violent gust of wind ripped across the street, tearing at her veil and whipping it back from her face. Samuel's breath caught in his throat. His fingers tightened on the cold windowsill. The world, the roaring wind and the biting cold, fell away into a sudden, roaring silence in his ears. It could not be. But it was. The face was older, etched with a sadness he did not recognize. But the lines of it, the curve of her jaw, the wide-set eyes, were burned into his memory. It was a face from another life, a life he had buried under 15 years of mountains and solitude. "Elizabeth, Libby," an image flashed in his mind, sharp and painful as a shard of glass. A sun-drenched riverbank in Missouri, the smell of honeysuckle and damp earth. Libby, her hair the color of corn silk, laughing as she dared him to climb the big sycamore tree, her voice clear as a bell. "You will not leave me behind. Sam Hawkins, you promise," and his own voice, young and foolish, "I promise." The memory vanished, leaving an ache in his chest. Back in the frozen present, he saw her on the church steps, her face pale in the lantern light. She looked small and terribly alone next to the bulk of James Morrison. Her eyes, as if pulled by the force of his stare, lifted from the street and scanned the buildings opposite. They moved past the dark windows of the general store, the alleyway, and then they stopped. They stopped on his window. He knew she could not possibly see him, a shadow in a dark room. But for the briefest of moments, her expression changed. The polite, vacant look of a bride on display dissolved. He saw a flicker of something else, a ghost of a memory, a question. It was there for a heartbeat, a silent message sent across a snowy street and a decade of silence. And then it was gone. Morrison's grip tightened on her arm, and her gaze fell. The mask was back in place. Morrison led her down the steps toward a handsome enclosed carriage that waited at the curb. A driver hunched against the storm on the front seat. The gesture was not tender. It was proprietary, the way a man might lead a prized but unpredictable horse. Samuel's eyes, trained to spot the slightest movement in a forest, caught another motion. In the deep, ink-black shadows of the alley between the blacksmith's and the mercantile, a figure stood motionless. The storm did not seem to touch him. It was the Ute warrior, Tava. He was not looking at the bride. His entire focus, sharp and unwavering as a hawk's, was on James Morrison. There was a cold, deep knowing in that stare, the look of a man who recognized a predator not by its claws, but by the way it moved through the world. Tava had seen men like Morrison before, men whose hunger for land and power was an endless, destructive force. He watched until the carriage door closed, swallowing Elizabeth whole, and then, as silently as he had appeared, he melted back into the shadows and was gone. The carriage pulled away, its wheels crunching in the snow, leaving the street empty once more. The church doors closed, and the world was just the storm again. Samuel let out a long, slow breath he did not realize he had been holding. The glass he had cleared was already frosting over. He felt a sudden, desperate urge to flee. He could wake the livery boy, take Buck, lame as he was, and push out into the blizzard. He would take his chances with the pass. It would be safer than this, safer than the ghost of a girl he had left behind. Later, the gnawing in his stomach drove him downstairs. The boarding house's common room was warm, heated by a pot-bellied stove that glowed a dull red. 2 old prospectors were huddled near it, nursing cups of coffee. Mrs. Gable, a woman whose face was a roadmap of worries, brought Samuel a plate of stew and a chunk of bread without him having to ask. "A grand affair for Mr. Morrison," one of the old men said, his voice a dry rustle. The second one grunted, spitting a stream of tobacco juice into a nearby spittoon. He is a man who gets what he wants. Always does. The first one agreed, but his eyes shifted nervously. Still, a bit quick. Is it not poor Martha, not even a year in the ground? Poor Martha, the second man repeated, and the way he said it was heavy with meaning. A clumsy woman. Martha was awful clumsy, to take a fall like that, all the way down that grand staircase of theirs. Samuel stopped eating, the spoon halfway to his mouth. He looked at the men. Their faces were carefully blank, their eyes fixed on the stove, but the air was thick with what they were not saying. He knew that tone. It was the way people talked when they were afraid. It was the sound of a town held in the grip of a powerful man, a town that kept its secrets buried under a thin layer of civility. He finished his meal in silence, the stew tasting like ash in his mouth. He left the coins on the table and went back up to the cold solitude of his room. He did not go back to the window. He did not need to. The image was seared into his mind, Elizabeth's face, pale and haunted, and the possessive grip of her new husband. The whispers of the old men downstairs echoed in his head. A clumsy woman. A fall down the stairs. The mountain man's code was simple. You did not meddle in other folks' trouble. You saw a dispute in a saloon. You turned and walked away. You heard a man and wife arguing. You pretended you were deaf. Your own survival was hard enough without taking on the weight of someone else's. It was a code that had kept him alive for 15 years. But this was different. This was Libby. This was a promise he had made by a river in Missouri. A promise he had broken when the lure of the mountains, of a life free from fences and expectations, had become too strong to resist. He had told himself he was setting her free. He had told himself she was better off without a restless wanderer like him. But looking at her face tonight, he knew he had only been telling himself a convenient lie. He had not just left a girl behind, he had left a part of himself back there on that riverbank, and now it had found him, here in a forgotten town in the middle of a blizzard, married to a man who collected whispers of death like he collected freighting contracts. The wind rattled the window frame, a mournful, lonely sound. Samuel sat on the edge of the bed, his head in his hands. To ride out in the morning meant turning his back on her again, leaving her to whatever fate awaited her in that grand house with the long staircase. To stay meant stepping into the middle of something deep and dangerous, something that had nothing to do with him and everything to do with him. All at once. The candle on the small table beside him flickered and guttered, the tiny flame dancing in the draught. It was a fragile, uncertain light, holding its own against a vast and hungry darkness. For the first time in a very long time, Samuel Hawkins did not know which way the trail led. Samuel did not return to the bed. The small room had become a cage, its four walls pressing in on him, the ghost of Libby, her face framed for a moment in the storm, was in the room with him now. He could not sit still with it. He needed air, even air that cut like a knife. He needed the cold to clear his head, to remind him of the simple, physical world he understood. He grabbed his heavy buckskin jacket and descended the creaking stairs. The common room was empty, the stove now a dark, hulking shape in the corner, its fire banked for the night. The only sound was the relentless scream of the wind against the building. He unlatched the front door and stepped out onto the narrow, covered porch. The cold was a brutal, cleansing shock. It drove the air from his lungs and made the skin on his face feel tight and brittle. Snow, driven almost horizontally by the wind, swirled and danced in the yellow lamplight that spilled from the boarding house windows. The street was deserted, a landscape of white and shadow. Across the way, the church was dark, but a few houses down, light still burned in the windows of the pastor's modest home. It seemed the wedding party had moved there for a small, private celebration, a final toast against the storm. He leaned against a wooden support post, letting the cold seep into him. This was his element. The storm was honest. It did not pretend to be anything other than what it was, a force of nature, powerful and impartial. It was the world of men that was filled with lies and hidden dangers. He stared at the pastor's house, a silent, unseen observer. He told himself he was just waiting for the last light to go out. Then he would go back inside, and in the morning, he would check on his horse and be gone. He would ride west, and Pine Ridge, with its ghosts and its powerful men, would become just another landmark he had left behind. The front door of the pastor's house opened. Morrison appeared first, a broad silhouette against the light. He was laughing, a deep, confident sound that carried even over the wind. He was followed by the pastor and his wife, both of them smiling and nodding. And then Elizabeth came out, Morrison's hand resting possessively on the small of her back. She was still in her white dress, a cloak thrown over her shoulders. Her face was a pale oval in the gloom. Samuel watched, his jaw tight. He saw the polite smile she offered the pastor's wife, a smile that did not reach her eyes. He saw the way she stood, a little too stiffly. As Morrison spoke his final goodbyes, the fine carriage was waiting for them again, a dark shape against the snow. Morrison turned her toward the street. As he did, her gaze swept across to the boarding house. She saw the dark figure standing in the shadows of the porch. It was impossible to know if she recognized him, if she could make out anything more than a shape. But she stopped. Her feet, in their delicate white shoes, ceased moving. "What is it?" Morrison asked, his voice impatient. "It is cold." "Just a moment," she said. Her voice was a low murmur, nearly lost in the wind. "I think I dropped something." "A glove." She pulled away from him, a small, deft movement. Before he could react, she took 2 quick steps back toward the house, pretending to look down at the snow-covered ground. Then, in a single, fluid motion that was both desperate and deliberate, she turned and started walking, not toward the house, and not toward the carriage. She started walking straight across the street, toward him. The wind tore at her, whipping her cloak and dress around her legs, but she moved with a fierce, determined grace. Each step was an act of defiance, a white ghost moving through a storm, coming for him. Samuel's heart hammered against his ribs. He was frozen to the spot, his muscles locked. The simple code he had lived by for 15 years was dissolving in the face of this impossible act. "Run!" His mind screamed the word. Run now, back into the mountains. But his feet were rooted to the wooden planks of the porch. She reached the edge of the street and stepped up onto the boardwalk, the snow crunching under her shoes. She did not stop until she was standing directly in front of him. So close he could see the snowflakes melting on her eyelashes. So close he could see the rapid pulse beating in the hollow of her throat. Her face was turned up to his, her eyes wide and dark with 1,000 unasked questions. The scent of her, something clean like lavender and cold air, cut through the smell of pine and snow. "You don't remember me, do you?" The words were a whisper, a thread of sound in the roaring gale. They were not an accusation, but a statement of profound, heartbreaking fact. She looked at him, and he saw the girl from the riverbank buried deep beneath the woman's fear and sorrow. "I was the girl you left behind. Mountain man," she whispered again, and this time, the words held the sharp edge of a 15-year-old wound. Before he could find his voice, before he could force a single word from his constricted throat, another figure loomed out of the storm. James Morrison strode across the street, his face a mask of cold fury. He did not shout. He did not make a scene. His movements were controlled, efficient, and terrible in their purpose. He reached the porch and his hand shot out, grabbing Elizabeth's arm just above the elbow. His fingers dug into the fabric of her cloak and threw it into her flesh. Samuel saw her wince, a flicker of pain crossing her features. He saw the white kid skin of her glove bunch and strain under the force of the grip. "Elizabeth," Morrison said, his voice dangerously soft. "The carriage is waiting." She looked from Morrison's furious face to Samuel's frozen one. In that single, fleeting glance, Samuel saw it all. The terror was there, stark and undeniable. But beneath it, there was a tiny, desperate spark of hope. The look was a plea, a question, a final, desperate gamble. She had crossed the street. She had spoken his name. The next move was Samuel's right hand, which had been resting on the porch rail, slowly curled into a fist. The knuckles went white. Every instinct he had honed in the wilderness screamed at him. This was a predator. This was a threat, and it had its claws in something he had long ago abandoned but never forgotten. He took a half-step forward. Morrison's eyes, cold and gray as river stones, shifted to meet his. For a long second, the two men stared at each other over the woman between them. There was no misunderstanding. A line had been drawn in the snow. "Come," Morrison said, his voice flat. He gave Elizabeth's arm a brutal tug, pulling her off balance and away from Samuel. He propelled her toward the street, his grip never slackening. She stumbled, catching herself, and shot one last look back at Samuel. A look of despair. Samuel watched them go. He watched Morrison force her into the carriage. He heard the door slam with a sound of finality, like a cell door clanging shut. The carriage lurched into motion and was quickly swallowed by the blizzard. The street was empty. The world was loud with the wind, but in Samuel's head, there was a deafening silence. He was alone on the porch, the cold air burning his lungs. The warmth of her presence, the scent of lavender, was already gone, replaced by the chilling reality of what he had just seen. That grip, the fear in her eyes. It was not a marriage. It was a prison. He was not completely alone. Unseen by the bride or her husband, another man had witnessed the entire exchange. From the absolute blackness of the alleyway, Teva watched. He had seen the woman cross the street. He had heard the low, tense voices. He had seen the way Morrison's hand had closed on her arm, like a trap snapping shut. He did not know the history between the mountain man and the white woman, but he did not need to. He recognized the man. He had seen men like Morrison in treaty negotiations and trading posts, men who spoke of laws and property, but whose only real law was their own appetite, men who saw land and animals and even people as things to be owned, to be fenced in, to have their freedom strangled. Teva watched the carriage disappear, and then his gaze settled on the solitary figure of Samuel Hawkins, standing motionless on the porch. The mountain man's fight was no longer with just a lame horse or an early blizzard. His fight had a name now. Teva faded back into the shadows, a silent observer who understood that the storm that had just passed across the street was far more dangerous than the one that raged in the sky. The blizzard broke on the second day, leaving behind a world of stunning, silent white. The sun was a pale disk in a washed-out sky, and the air was so cold it hurt to breathe. Pine Ridge dug itself out. Men shoveled paths, their breath clouding in front of them, the scrape of their tools the only sound in the muffled landscape. The immediate, raw threat of the storm was gone, replaced by the mundane realities of survival. But the tension that had arrived with the first flakes of snow did not leave with the last. It settled over the town like a shroud. For 3 days, Samuel waited. The pass was still choked with snow, and Buck's leg, while improving, was not yet ready for the high trails. He told himself this was the only reason he stayed. He spent his time at the livery, helping the boy, Daniel, with the horses, or sitting by the blacksmith's forge, absorbing the heat and listening. In a town like Pine Ridge, listening was more informative than asking. The wedding of James Morrison was the only topic of conversation. The whispers followed Samuel everywhere, from the general store to the porch of the boarding house. They were quiet, guarded conversations that stopped the moment he drew near, but he caught fragments, words like strange and hurried and poor thing. He learned that the new Mrs. Morrison had not been seen since her wedding night, not at church on Sunday, not in the mercantile, not even for a breath of fresh air on her own porch. The Morrison Ranch was a mile out of town, a large, imposing house with a new wing built on, a testament to its owner's prosperity. It stood on a low rise, visible from the edge of town. Looking down on Pine Ridge, it was a king's castle, and people spoke of it with a mixture of envy and fear. On the third day, Samuel was in the mercantile, trading a marten pelt for a sack of coffee. When a woman came in, she was middle-aged and worn down, her hands red and chapped. He recognized her as one of Morrison's household staff. He had seen her driving a supply wagon once. Her name was Mrs. Dobbs. She moved with a nervous energy, her eyes darting toward the door as if she expected to be followed. She gave her order to the proprietor in a low, trembling voice. Flour, lard, and a new padlock, a heavy one. The proprietor, a man named Henderson, raised an eyebrow. Another padlock, Sarah, Mr. Morrison is a careful man. Mrs. Dobbs did not meet his gaze. She stared at a crack in the floorboards. He just wants to be sure everything is secure, with his wife being new to the territory and all. He worries for her safety. The words were meant to be reassuring, but her tone was hollow. Samuel watched as Henderson placed a heavy iron padlock on the counter, the kind used for a stable door or a jail cell. Mrs. Dobbs paid for her goods, her hands shaking so badly she dropped a coin. She snatched it up and practically fled from the store. Samuel's blood ran cold. He knew, with a certainty that settled in his gut like a stone, what that lock was for. It was not for a smokehouse or a grain bin. It was for a door locked from the outside. He spent the rest of the day in a state of quiet torment. He walked to the edge of town and stared at the Morrison house, a distant, dark shape against the snow. The mountain man's code, the law of self-preservation that had governed his life, was at war with the image of Libby's face, her whispered words, and the brutal grip of her husband's hand. To walk away now, knowing what he knew, was not just leaving her behind. It was leaving her in a cage. It was a cowardice his solitary life had never demanded of him before. He was checking Buck's leg in the fading light of evening when a shadow fell over him. He looked up, his hand instinctively moving toward the knife on his belt. Tava stood there, as silent as the snow. He was not looking at Samuel, but at the Morrison house on the hill. The horse will be ready to travel by morning, the Ute said. His voice was low and even. The pass is clear enough for a single rider who knows the way. Samuel straightened up, running a hand over Buck's neck. I know. Your path is west, Tava continued, his eyes still fixed on the distant house. But your spirit is chained to that hill. I see it. Samuel said nothing. There was nothing to say. This man saw more with a single glance than most townsfolk saw in a lifetime. That man, Morrison, Tava said, his voice hardening almost imperceptibly. He is a feeder. He feeds on land, on the fear of smaller men. My people know his kind. He is the contractor for the railroad, the iron snake that comes to swallow the land. They want to push the tracks through our winter valley, a place our people have hunted for 100 generations. Morrison's wagons bring the steel and the whiskey and the hungry men. He grows rich while our hunting grounds shrink. Tava finally turned to look at Samuel. His dark eyes were intense, holding no pity, only a shared, grim understanding. He wants this entire valley, the town, the ranches, the Ute lands, all of it. He is a man who builds cages. For his wife, for my people. How do you know about his wife? Samuel asked, his voice a low growl. Tava gave a slight, almost imperceptible shrug. A man who locks a door from the outside is a man who fears what is inside. He fears a truth that might escape. I have watched the house. I have seen the housekeeper, the woman who came to the store today. Her fear is loud. The two men stood in silence for a long moment, the cold air thick with unspoken words. They were from different worlds, their people often at odds. But in that moment, they understood each other perfectly. They were both men of the wild, men who valued freedom above all else, and they were both looking at the same cage. Morrison is not just a cruel husband, Tava said, his voice dropping lower. He is a thief, but he is a clever thief. He uses paper and laws as his weapons. He has a ledger in his office at the freight depot. In it, he keeps a record of all his dealing. The real records, shipping weights that do not match the railroads, insurance claims for goods he reports stolen by Indians, goods that were never stolen at all. He creates emergencies to drive down the price of land so he and the railroad can buy it for nothing. He is poisoning this valley, and he is using my people's name to do it. He paused, letting the weight of his words settle. If a man like you, a white man the town respects, or at least fears, were to get that book, if you were to show it to the right people, to the judge who is not yet in Morrison's pocket, you could break him. You could show the whole town the snake they have welcomed into their home. And what is in it for you? Samuel asked, his eyes narrowing. Justice is a circle, Teva replied. You help warn the town, you help stop the iron snake from carving up our valley, and my people will help you. We know the ways of that house. We know the patrols. We know when he comes and goes. When the time is right, we can help you get her out. A fair trade. My people's freedom for hers. Samuel looked from the Ute warrior to the cold, distant house on the hill. The path had been forked. A choice between his own freedom and Libby's. Now, a third path had appeared. One he had never imagined. It was a path that led not away from the trouble, but straight into the heart of it. It was a path of alliance, a dangerous and uncertain trail, but it was the only one that felt true. To leave now would be to leave more than just a woman in a locked room. It would be to surrender the valley and a part of his own soul to a man like Morrison. I am not a man for towns, Samuel said slowly, or for their laws. Teva nodded. I know. You're a man of the mountains, but the mountains are now part of this fight. Morrison wants to own them too. This is not about the town's law. It is about the land's law. A predator that grows too greedy must be stopped, or the entire herd will perish. He told Samuel his plan. It was simple, audacious, and deadly. Teva had watched the freight depot for 2 nights. He knew the night watchman was old and drank from a hidden bottle. He knew Morrison's office window had a faulty latch. Teva would go in. He was a ghost. He could move through the town unseen. Samuel's part was to create a diversion on the far side of town. A disturbance just loud enough to draw the attention of the single patrolman who walked the streets after midnight. That night, under a sliver of a moon in a sky full of cold, hard stars, Samuel did as he was asked. He untied 2 horses from the back of the saloon, gave them a smart smack on their rumps, and sent them galloping down the far end of the street. The sound of shouting and cursing that followed was all Tava needed. Samuel slipped back into the shadows and waited. The minutes stretched into an eternity. The cold bit at his skin. Finally, a figure emerged from the darkness behind the freight depot. It was Tava. In his hand, he carried a thick, leather-bound book. He moved to Samuel's side and held it out. He did not say a word. He did not have to. The weight of the book in Samuel's hands was the weight of a new promise. A promise not to run, but to stand and fight. The personal tragedy of Elizabeth Turner and the public crime against the Ute people were now one and the same, their fates bound together in the stolen pages of a liar's ledger. The ledger was a heavy, cold weight in Samuel's hands. For 2 nights, he sat with it in his small room, deciphering Morrison's spidery, arrogant script by candlelight. Teva had been right. It was all there, the fraudulent insurance claims, the phantom cargo, the payrolls for men who did not exist. It was a detailed map of one man's greed, a greed that was slowly strangling the life out of the valley. But it was just a book, words on a page. He needed more. He needed the town to see the man, not just his crimes. He was waiting, listening, every nerve ending taut as a tripwire. The town was holding its breath, and Samuel knew that sooner or later it would have to let it out. The exhale came on the 3rd night, not as a sigh, but as a scream. A cry of fire shattered the frozen stillness of the night. Samuel was on his feet before the 2nd shout echoed down the street. From his window, He saw it, a malevolent orange glow painting the underside of the clouds in the direction of the Morrison Ranch. It was not the house itself, but a smaller building nearby. The carriage house. He did not stop to think. He grabbed his jacket and his Hawken rifle. His mind a cold, clear slate. He was down the stairs and out the door in seconds, joining the stream of men running toward the blaze. Doors slammed open all down the street. Figures emerged, some with buckets, others with just the terrified, mesmerized look of people drawn to disaster. The mile to the ranch was a desperate, lung-searing run through the snow. As they got closer, the glow became a roaring pillar of flame, and the night air filled with the crackle of burning timber and the panicked whinnying of horses from a nearby stable. The carriage house was completely engulfed, a giant, hungry bonfire against the dark. Snow-covered fields, sparks and burning embers rained down, hissing as they hit the snow. A bucket brigade was already forming, a frantic, futile effort against the inferno. Samuel saw the sheriff, a stout man named Miller, trying to organize the chaos. And then he saw Morrison. He was standing near the main house, his arms crossed, his face a mask of what a stranger might mistake for shock. But Samuel saw the cold, watchful calculation in his eyes. He was watching his problem burn. "Where is your wife?" Samuel's voice cut through the noise, a low growl that made several men turn. Morrison's head snapped toward him, his expression hardening. "In the house, of course, where she belongs. She is overwrought." But then a woman's shriek cut through the air. It was Mrs. Dobbs, her face streaked with soot and tears, her hands twisting in her apron. "No!" she screamed, her voice cracking with terror. He locked her in the upstairs room, the old apartment over the carriages. He said she was hysterical. He locked her in. A collective gasp went through the crowd. All eyes turned from the fire to Morrison, whose face had gone pale with fury. "It was an accident," he snarled, taking a step toward the housekeeper. "The fool woman is lying." But Samuel was no longer listening. He was moving. He sprinted toward the burning building, grabbing a heavy woodsman's axe that was leaning against the main house's porch. The heat was a solid wall, pushing him back. Smoke billowed from the roof and windows, thick and black. The main doors were already collapsing inward, a gateway to hell. But on the side of the building, a narrow wooden staircase led to a second-floor entrance, the one Mrs. Dobbs had been talking about. The door at the top of the stairs was thick oak, and as Samuel got closer, he saw the glint of new metal, the heavy iron padlock. He went up the stairs 2 at a time, the wood groaning and hot under his boots. He swung the axe, the blade biting deep into the wood near the lock. The crowd below fell silent, watching the lone figure silhouetted against the flames. He swung again and again, his shoulders and back screaming with the effort. The smoke was a choking blanket, searing his lungs. The heat was blistering his skin. Wood splintered. The frame began to give, with a final, desperate roar. He threw his shoulder against the damaged door. It burst open. He stumbled into a room filled with thick, rolling smoke. He could see nothing. He dropped to his hands and knees, the air slightly clearer near the floor. "Libby!" he yelled, his voice a raw croak. "Libby!" He heard a faint cough from the far corner of the room. He crawled toward the sound, his eyes streaming, every breath a gulp of fire. He found her crumpled on the floor, her white nightgown gray with soot. She was barely conscious. He scooped her up in his arms. She was terrifyingly light. He turned and plunged back toward the doorway, the flames now licking at the opening. He did not feel the burning ember that landed on his jacket sleeve. All he knew was the fragile weight in his arms and the desperate need to get her to the clean, cold air. He emerged onto the landing, a figure from a nightmare, and the crowd let out a collective cheer that was half relief and half horror. He carried her down the steps and away from the collapsing building, laying her gently on the snow. Her face was smudged with black, her hair singed. She coughed. A deep, racking sound. But she was breathing. Her eyes fluttered open, and for a moment, they focused on his face. Recognition flickered. Then they rolled back in her head. "Dr. Whitman," someone yelled. "Get her to the doctor." The town's physician, a grim, no-nonsense man with tired eyes, pushed through the crowd. "I will take her. My office is warmer." He looked at Samuel, then at the livid face of James Morrison, who was being held back by the sheriff. "You," he said to Samuel, his voice firm. "You come too. You brought her out." The walk back to town was a surreal procession. Samuel, his jacket smoking, walked beside the small group of men carrying Elizabeth. The townspeople followed, a silent, accusing mob. They arrived at the doctor's small office and clinic. Whitman shooed everyone out except for Samuel and Sheriff Miller. He laid Elizabeth on an examination table and began to gently cut away the soot-stained nightgown. "Now we will see," he murmured, more to himself than to anyone else. As the fabric came away, a low gasp came from the sheriff. Elizabeth's arms and shoulders were a canvas of bruises. There were yellowish, fading marks, and angry, fresh ones, purple and black. On her left arm, just above the elbow, were the distinct and brutal imprints of 4 fingers and a thumb. Whitman worked in grim silence, cleaning her face, checking her breathing. "She is lucky," he said finally, his voice tight with fury. "The smoke nearly took her, but these—" he gestured to the bruises. "These did not come from any fire." At that moment, the door burst open and Morrison, flanked by 2 of his hired men, stormed in. "I demand to see my wife. This is an outrage." Sheriff Miller, who had been looking pale and uncertain, seemed to find his spine. "No, you do not. James, you are under arrest, for endangerment, maybe for more." Morrison laughed. A cold, ugly sound. "On what grounds? The word of a hysterical servant and a half-wild mountain man. My wife is unwell. She is prone to fits. She must have overturned a lamp. It is a tragedy." "But the town is not blind." "James," Dr. Whitman said, stepping between Morrison and the table. "And neither am I. I have seen bruises from falls. These are not from falls. The people saw the lock. They heard Mrs. Dobbs. It is over." The sheriff drew his pistol. His hand was shaking, but he held it steady. "You will come with me, now." For a moment, it seemed Morrison would fight. His eyes, burning with hate, were locked on Samuel. Then his expression changed. He relaxed. He even smiled. A thin, reptilian stretching of his lips. "Very well, Sheriff. If you insist on this theater, let us go." He was led out, leaving a profound silence in his wake. Samuel stood by the wall, watching Elizabeth breathe. She was shivering, a deep, uncontrollable trembling that shook her whole body. The doctor covered her with a thick wool blanket. Samuel walked to the table. He looked down at her face, so pale against the rough blanket. He reached out, and his hand, large and calloused, gently took hers. Her fingers were ice cold. They curled weakly around his. He did not say anything. He just stood there, holding her hand, a solid, warm anchor in a world that had just tried to burn her alive. She stirred, her eyelids fluttering. "Sam," she whispered, the sound barely audible. "I am here," he said, his voice softer than he had ever heard it. He pulled a stool over and sat beside her, never letting go of her hand. They sat that way for nearly an hour. Dr. Whitman cleaned and bandaged the burn on Samuel's arm. The town's quiet returned, heavier than before. Then the door opened. It was a deputy, looking flustered and angry. "He is gone," the deputy stammered, looking at the sheriff. "Morrison, his lawyer from Durango, was waiting at the jailhouse, posted a bond so high I could not believe it. He just walked out, said he had urgent business to attend to. He is gone." A cold dread settled back into the room. Samuel looked at Elizabeth. Her eyes were open, and they were filled with a terror that no fire could ever produce. She had been saved from the flames, but the monster was still out there. He squeezed her hand gently. He leaned down, his face close to hers, and brushed a stray lock of hair from her forehead. He hesitated for only a second. Then he pressed his lips to her brow. It was not a kiss of passion, but a promise, a silent vow that this was not over. He had stayed. He had interfered, and he would see it through to the end. He was no longer just a mountain man passing through. He was the man who had stayed. James Morrison's escape left a vacuum in the town, and fear rushed in to fill it. Pine Ridge had seen the fire and the bruises, but it had also seen the power of money and a slick lawyer. The law, which had felt solid for a few brief moments in the sheriff's hands, now seemed like a fragile, useless thing. Elizabeth remained at Dr. Whitman's clinic, a sanctuary with a lock on the inside of the door. She was quiet, but her eyes, when they met Samuel's, were no longer filled with just terror. A hard, cold anger was beginning to form there, like ice on a winter pond. The next morning, the other shoe dropped. A man from the Denver and Rio Grande Railroad, a director named Wallace, rode into town with a half-dozen armed men. They were not lawmen. They were hard cases with cold eyes and rifles that they never let stray too far from their hands. They set up at the saloon, and within hours, the pressure on the town began. Wallace and his men started visiting the small ranchers whose property lay along the proposed rail route. The very route Morrison was contracted to supply. Their offers were insultingly low. When the ranchers refused, the men would smile, their hands resting on their pistols, and speak of the dangers of living in such an unsettled territory. They mentioned Indian raids. They mentioned unexplained fires. The threats were never direct, but they hung in the air like smoke. That evening, as Samuel sat sharpening his knife by the stove in the doctor's office, Tava appeared in the doorway. He had not used the knob. He simply materialized from the shadows, his presence a sudden, undeniable fact. "He comes for the valley," Tava said, his voice a low rumble. He did not need to say Morrison's name. "His men are pushing my people from the winter grounds. They say the land now belongs to the railroad. They have papers. And they have guns," Samuel said, not looking up from his whetstone. "Papers can be fought with other papers," Tava said. He looked at Samuel, his gaze intense. "Guns can be fought with other guns. You have the book. The circuit judge, Carlton, arrives tomorrow. He is said to be an honest man." "He is one man," Samuel replied, the steel whispering against the stone. "Morrison has the railroad behind him. That is more powerful than any judge. One man with the truth is a powerful thing in a town full of whispers," Tava countered. "You must show him the book, and she—" He nodded toward the closed door of the room where Elizabeth was resting. "Must speak her truth. The town saw you pull her from the fire. They saw the lock. They will listen to her now." Samuel fell silent. He knew the Ute was right. The ledger alone was not enough. It needed a human voice, a story of cruelty that people could understand in their bones. He was asking Elizabeth to face her monster in a public room, to lay her pain and fear out for everyone to see. It was more than any man had a right to ask. When he spoke to her later, she was sitting by the window, staring out at the hostile lights of the saloon across the street. She was wrapped in a borrowed wool shawl, looking small and fragile. "He will not stop," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "Before he had even spoken. As long as I am alive, he will see me as his property, something that defied him." Samuel stood by the door, the ledger heavy in his hand. "The circuit judge comes tomorrow. Tava and I, we think if you were to speak, to tell the judge what happened that night, it might be enough. With this book." He watched her shoulders stiffen. He saw the fear in the taut line of her back. He expected her to refuse, and he would not have blamed her. She turned to face him. Her eyes were dark, but the fear in them was overshadowed by the cold, hard anger he had seen earlier. Her voice when she spoke, was no longer a whisper. It was quiet, but it was as solid as stone. "I will do it," she said. "I will not let him burn me alive and then pretend it was an accident. I will speak." The next day, the town hall was filled to bursting. It was a makeshift courtroom, with Judge Carlton, a formidable man with a granite jaw and eyes that seemed to miss nothing, sitting at a simple wooden table at the front. Sheriff Miller stood beside him, looking uneasy. On one side of the room sat Wallace, the railroad director, flanked by his hired guns. On the other side, the townspeople of Pine Ridge were packed together, their faces a mixture of fear, anger, and morbid curiosity. Samuel was called first. He placed the heavy ledger on the table in front of the judge. In a low, clear voice, he explained how he had come by it. Then he opened it and began to speak. He pointed to the entries, his calloused finger tracing the lines of Morrison's lies. He explained the inflated freight costs, the insurance claims for goods supposedly lost in Ute raids that had never happened. He presented a picture of a systematic fraud that implicated not just Morrison, but the railroad itself. Wallace objected, his voice booming and self-righteous, but Judge Carlton silenced him with a single, sharp look. "I will hear the man out." When Samuel was finished, a low murmur went through the crowd. The evidence was compelling, but it was still just numbers in a book. Judge Carlton looked at Samuel. "You have made a serious accusation of fraud, Mr. Hawkins, and you were present at the fire at the Morrison property." "I was," Samuel said. "The defendant, James Morrison, is not present." The judge continued, "But his wife is. I would like to hear from her." A path cleared as Dr. Whitman escorted Elizabeth to the front of the room. She was pale, and her hands were clasped tightly in front of her to keep them from shaking. But she walked with her head held high. She did not look at the crowd. She looked only at the judge. She took an oath, her voice trembling slightly on the words. Then the judge spoke to her, his tone softer than it had been with Samuel. "Mrs. Morrison," he said, "please tell me, in your own words, what happened on the night of the fire." Elizabeth took a deep breath. "I was in the apartment over the carriage house," she began. "My husband and I had a disagreement. He became angry. He said I needed time to calm myself, to reflect on my duties as a wife." Her voice faltered for a moment, and she looked at Samuel. He gave her a single, almost imperceptible nod. It was all the strength she needed. "He pushed me into the room," she continued, her voice growing stronger. "And then I heard the sound. I heard the sound of the bolt on the outside of the door, and then the padlock. I heard the click of the padlock." A wave of shock and anger rippled through the room. "And the fire," the judge prompted gently. "I do not know how it started," she said, her voice dropping again. "I smelled the smoke. I screamed, but no one could hear me over the storm. The room filled with smoke. I thought I was going to die." Then the door broke open. "And he," she pointed a slightly trembling finger at Samuel, "he carried me out." Judge Carlton stared at her for a long moment, his face unreadable. Then he turned his stony gaze on Wallace and his men. He picked up his gavel and struck the table once. The sharp crack echoed in the silent room. "Based on the testimony of Mrs. Elizabeth Morrison and the evidence presented by Mr. Samuel Hawkins," he announced, his voice ringing with authority, "I am issuing a warrant for the immediate arrest of James Morrison on the charge of attempted murder, and I am launching a full investigation into the business practices of this railroad. Sheriff, you will form a posse and execute this warrant. Now." Pandemonium erupted. The townspeople cheered. Wallace and his men rose to their feet, their face dark with fury. In the confusion, Samuel saw Tava slip out a side door. Sheriff Miller, his face grim but resolute, deputized Samuel and 3 other stout men from the town. They checked their weapons and headed for the door, their purpose clear. They would bring James Morrison in, one way or another. They made their way down the main street toward the freight depot, where Morrison was known to be staying. The town was quiet now, the people watching from their windows. The air was thick with anticipation. As they approached the old wooden bridge that crossed the creek at the edge of town, Samuel felt a familiar prickle on the back of his neck. The feeling of being watched, the feeling of walking into a trap. The first shot came from the thicket of aspens on the far side of the creek. It splintered the wooden rail of the bridge, inches from the sheriff's head. Everyone dove for cover. 2 more shots rang out, then a fusillade. Morrison's men were dug in, hidden among the trees and rocks along the riverbank. They were trapped. The gunfight was fast and brutal. The sheriff's men were townspeople, not fighters. They fired back, but their shots were wild. Samuel, taking cover behind an overturned ore cart, was methodical. He fired, reloaded, and fired again. His Hawken rifle finding its mark twice, but there were too many of them. He was pinned down, a crossfire kicking up dirt and snow all around him. He saw a puff of smoke from a rocky outcrop to his right, a position that flanked his own. He knew he was exposed. He braced himself for the impact, for the searing pain of the bullet. Another rifle shot cracked through the air, but it was from a different direction. Higher up, the man in the rocky outcrop, who had been drawing a bead on Samuel, suddenly jerked backward and then fell, his rifle clattering on the rocks. Samuel looked up toward the low ridge that overlooked the bridge. Standing there, partially concealed by a stand of tall pines, was Tava. The Ute warrior held his rifle, a thin wisp of smoke curling from the barrel. He had been their guardian angel, their unseen protector. He fired again, and another of the ambushers cried out and fell silent. Tava's intervention broke the back of the ambush. With 2 of their men down, the remaining hired guns lost their nerve. They broke cover and fled back toward the railroad camp. The sheriff and his men gave chase, leaving Samuel alone by the bridge in the sudden, ringing silence. He stood up, his ears humming. He looked up at the ridge. Tava was still there. He raised a hand, not in a wave, but in a sign of acknowledgement. Samuel raised his hand in return. No words were needed. A bond that had been forged in suspicion and sealed with a shared purpose had now been tempered in the heat of battle. They had a common enemy, and they had saved each other's lives. The fight for the valley, and for Elizabeth, was far from over, but they would face it together. The escape from Pine Ridge was a desperate, silent flight. With Morrison vanished and the railroad's gunmen regrouping, the town was no longer a sanctuary. It was a baited trap. Tava led them, not on the main trails, but through a series of hidden game paths and winding arroyos that only he knew. He moved with the fluid certainty of a man reading a familiar map, a map invisible to anyone else. They rode hard, pushing the horses, including Samuel's now recovered buck, through the deep snow and into the rugged, wind-swept high country of the Uncompahgre Plateau. For 2 days, they traveled, the world a vast, empty expanse of white and blue. The air grew thin and sharp, and the silence was broken only by the crunch of hooves and the lonely cry of the wind. Elizabeth rode without complaint, her face set with a grim determination that Samuel had never seen in her before. She was no longer just the girl from the riverbank or the terrified bride. She was a survivor, her spirit hardened in the crucible of fear and fire. On the evening of the 2nd day, as a bitter wind began to howl across the plateau, Tava led them to a shallow cave carved into the side of a red rock mesa. It was not much, just a deep overhang sheltered from the wind, but it was refuge. Tava gathered dry juniper wood from the gnarled trees that clung to the rock face, and soon he had a small, efficient fire blazing. The flames pushed back the encroaching darkness and the biting cold, creating a tiny pocket of warmth and life in the immense, indifferent wilderness. They shared a meal of dried jerky and hard biscuits, the silence comfortable, the shared ordeal a bond stronger than words. Samuel's arm, burned in the fire, was a throbbing ache. He had wrapped it crudely, but it needed tending. Elizabeth noticed him favoring it, his movements stiff and pained. She rose and came to his side, her expression serious. "Let me see," she said, her voice quiet but firm. He hesitated for a moment, the old instinct to hide any weakness still strong, but he looked into her eyes and saw only a calm, steady competence. He unwrapped the makeshift bandage. The burn was angry and red. Teva, who had been watching from his place by the fire, rose and disappeared into the darkness. He returned a few moments later with a handful of leaves, which he crushed between two stones to make a green, fragrant poultice. "It will draw out the fire and keep the spirit of the wound clean," he said simply, offering it to Elizabeth. She took it without question and began to gently apply the cool balm to Samuel's arm. Her touch was light and sure. As she worked, rewrapping his arm with a clean strip of cloth torn from her own petticoat, their proximity in the flickering firelight became a world of its own. Samuel was acutely aware of the scent of her hair, the soft sound of her breathing, the warmth of her fingers on his skin. He had spent 15 years avoiding this very thing, this simple, profound connection to another human being. And now, he found he could not imagine being anywhere else. When she was finished, she did not move away immediately. The wind howled outside their small shelter, a mournful, wild sound. "I was so afraid," she whispered, her eyes on the fire. "In that room, I thought of my mother, I thought of Missouri, and I thought of you. I wondered if you were still out here, somewhere, if you had found what you were looking for." "I was not looking for anything," Samuel said, his voice a low rumble. "I was just running." From what she asked, turning to look at him, he met her gaze. "From promises, I suppose, from feeling like I would never be enough for a place, or a person." She reached out and took his hand, her fingers lacing with his. The cold of the night was a real and present danger, pressing in at the edges of the firelight. They huddled closer together, sharing a single wool blanket, but it was not enough. The chill was seeping up from the stone floor. Samuel looked at the bundle of belongings he had retrieved from the doctor's office for her. Among them was a large, awkward shape wrapped in canvas. It was her wedding dress. He had taken it, not knowing why, only that it seemed wrong to leave the last remnant of her old life behind. He stood and unwrapped it. In the firelight, the heavy white satin glowed. The hem was blackened and singed from the fire, a dark, ugly scar on its purity. It was a ghost, a symbol of a life that had almost ended. He spread it on the floor of the cave, the satin cool against the rough stone. Then he laid the wool blanket on top of it. "It is thicker than just the one blanket," he said, his voice practical. Though his heart was pounding, "It will keep the cold out." Elizabeth looked at the dress, at the scorched hem, and a slow, sad smile touched her lips. She understood. The past, burned and broken, was being repurposed. It was no longer a shroud, but a foundation. She lay down on the makeshift bed, and he lay down beside her, pulling the blanket over them both. They lay on their sides, facing each other, the firelight dancing on their faces. Teva sat on the other side of the fire, his back to them, a silent, watchful guardian, his attention fixed on the flames and the vast, dark wilderness beyond. "I used to dream of this," Elizabeth said, her voice so soft he had to lean closer to hear it. "Not this, exactly, not running for my life, but the mountains. When I was a girl in Missouri, I would read stories about the trappers and the explorers. Everyone I knew dreamed of a safe life in the East. I dreamed of rivers without bridges and land without fences. I think I was always meant to be heading this way. I just took a very wrong turn." Her words were a revelation. He had always seen her as a creature of that other world, the world of towns and gentle living that he had fled. He had carried the guilt of leaving her behind, of pulling her toward a wildness she was never meant for, but she had been coming toward it all along. He reached out and his fingers gently traced the line of her jaw. "You are not the girl I left behind," he said, his voice thick with an emotion he could not name. "No," she whispered, her eyes searching his. "I am not." The distance between them vanished. He leaned in and kissed her. It was a kiss born of shared terror and miraculous survival, of old wounds and new hope. It was deep and slow and filled with the unspoken truths of the last few days. It was a kiss of recognition, a soul seeing its counterpart after a long and painful journey apart. When they finally broke apart, they were both breathless. She rested her forehead against his, her hand clutching the front of his buckskin jacket. "Do you recognize me now, mountain man?" she whispered, her voice a warm breath in the cold air. He gathered her closer, his arms wrapping around her, pulling her against the solid warmth of his body. He was no longer running. He was home. "I recognize you," he answered, his voice a low, certain vow in the heart of the wilderness. "You are my home." The peace they found in the high country was a fragile thing, a brief, warm breath in the heart of a long winter. It lasted 4 days. On the 5th, Teva, who had been scouting the lowlands like a restless spirit, returned to their camp at dusk. He carried no game. He carried only news, and his face was a mask of grim urgency. "He has broken out," the Ute said, his voice flat, devoid of surprise. The jail in Pine Ridge was a cage of wood, not steel. His lawyer paid the right people. Morrison is free. Samuel, who had been cleaning his rifle by the fire, did not stop his methodical work. Elizabeth, who was mending a tear in her cloak, froze, her needle poised in midair. "That is not all," Teva continued. "He rode into town this morning, not hiding, but like a king returning to his throne. He nailed a notice to the sheriff's door, a challenge." "What kind of challenge?" Samuel asked, his voice dangerously quiet. Teva met his gaze across the fire. "He named you. Hawkins. He called you a thief and a coward who hides behind a woman. He said the matter would be settled. His words, for all to see. Noon, Main Street, tomorrow." A profound silence descended upon their small camp, broken only by the crackle of the fire and the low moan of the wind. Elizabeth's face was pale, but her eyes, when she looked at Samuel, were not filled with the pleading fear he might have once expected. They were filled with a cold, clear light. She had been a victim. She would not be a widow. "We have the ledger," she said, her voice steady. "The law is on our side. You do not have to meet him. This is not your fight." Samuel finally looked up from his rifle, the polished steel gleaming in the firelight. "He broke the law when he put a lock on the outside of your door. Libby, he broke it again when he tried to burn you alive, and he broke it when he set a trap for the sheriff on that bridge. The law in this valley is what a man is willing to stand up for. I am not running anymore." There was no more discussion. The decision was made, not in words, but in a shared, unspoken understanding. They were no longer running from Morrison. They were going to meet him. They were going to end this. They rode back into Pine Ridge the next morning, not as fugitives, but as arbiters of a fate the town was too scared to decide for itself. The town was a different place. The streets were nearly empty. The usual morning bustle of wagons and tradesmen was gone. Faces watched them from behind curtained windows, their expressions a mixture of fear and a desperate, hungry hope. The air was stretched thin, humming with a tension that was almost a physical force. They went straight to the mercantile. Henderson, the proprietor, gave them a grim nod and let them in without a word. From the second-story window, they had a clear view of Main Street, from the saloon at one end to the church at the other. Teva left them there, melting into the alleyways. He would find his own place, a shadow's perch from which to watch the drama unfold. Elizabeth stood beside Samuel, a rifle in her hands. It was not his heavy Hawken, but a lighter Winchester that Henderson had provided. She held it with a familiarity that surprised him. "My father taught me," she said, anticipating his question. "He said a woman in this country needed to know which end the bullet came out of." Samuel looked at her, at the determined set of her jaw, and the last remnant of the girl he had left behind in Missouri vanished. In her place stood a woman of the West, forged in fire and fear, and he had never loved her more. "Stay here," he told her. "Watch the rooftops. Morrison will not fight fair." "I know," she said, her hand briefly touching his arm. "He will not be expecting me." Samuel gave her one last look, a long, silent conversation that said everything words could not. Then he turned and walked down the stairs and out into the unnerving quiet of the street. The sun was high and bright, making the remaining patches of snow glitter. A light wind kicked up dust, a fine, gritty powder that swirled around his boots. It was 10 minutes to noon. He walked to the center of the street, the same spot where Elizabeth had crossed to him in the blizzard, and he stopped. He stood alone, a solitary, unmoving figure in the vast, empty space. The church bell began to toll. The first stroke was a deep, resonant bong that echoed off the false fronts of the buildings. 1. Samuel's gaze was fixed on the far end of the street, toward the freight depot. 2. He could feel the eyes of the town on him, 100 invisible threads of hope and fear. 3. He calmed his breathing, the way he did when he was tracking a grizzly, letting the world slow down until he could see every detail. 4. He saw movement. A group of men emerged from the depot, Morrison's hired guns. They fanned out, taking up positions in doorways and on the boardwalk, their rifles held ready. And then Morrison himself appeared. He was dressed in black, a stark figure against the dusty street. He walked with a confident, arrogant swagger, a man who believed the world was his to command. He stopped about 50 paces from Samuel, a cruel smile playing on his lips. So the mountain man came down from his hole. Morrison called out, his voice carrying in the thin air. "I knew you could not resist." The church bell tolled again. 10. "This is between you and me." "Morrison," Samuel said, his voice even and calm. "Let the town be." "The town?" Morrison laughed. A harsh, ugly sound. "The town is mine. She is mine. Everything in this valley is mine. And you are just a ghost who does not know he is dead yet." 11. The final peal before noon. A hush fell over the world. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. As the first chime of the 12th stroke began to ring, Morrison's hand moved. It was a blur, a flash of motion as he went for the pistol holstered on his hip. But two things happened in that same split second of time. Samuel's Hawken was already rising, the movement smooth and practiced, a part of him. And from the second-story window of the Mercantile, a puff of smoke erupted. 2 shots rang out, so close together they sounded like a single, deafening crack. A searing, white-hot pain tore through Samuel's left shoulder. He staggered back a step, the impact spinning him sideways, but he stayed on his feet. At the same moment, James Morrison was thrown backward as if struck by an invisible fist. A dark stain blossomed on the front of his black coat. He looked down at his chest, his face a mask of disbelief. He collapsed to his knees, then pitched forward into the dust. A collective sigh of relief seemed to rise from the town. It was over. But it was not. With a final, gargantuan effort of will and hate, Morrison pushed himself up onto one elbow. His confident smile was gone, replaced by a snarling, animalistic grimace. His right hand, which had been hidden beneath him, came up. It held a small, silver derringer, a snake of a gun he had kept concealed. He leveled it at Samuel. The world seemed to move in slow motion. Samuel tried to bring his rifle around, but his left arm was a dead weight, and the pain was a blinding fog. Then a third shot boomed, a deep, concussive blast that was louder than the first two combined. It did not come from the Mercantile or from the street. It came from the doorway of the sheriff's office. Sheriff Miller stood there, his face grim, a smoking shotgun held steady in his hands. Morrison's head snapped back, and he fell to the ground, his body going limp. The silver derringer fell from his lifeless fingers into the dust. For a long, ringing moment, there was absolute silence. Then, from the doorways and alleys, Morrison's hired guns, their leader dead, their confidence shattered, began to slip away. They faded back into the woodwork, their brief reign of terror over. The doors of Pine Ridge began to open. People emerged slowly, cautiously, as if waking from a long nightmare. Elizabeth was the first one to reach Samuel, her face pale, her eyes wide with concern. She tore a strip from her petticoat and began to staunch the flow of blood from his shoulder. It was a clean shot, through the muscle, but it was deep. Tava appeared at his other side, a silent, reassuring presence. He looked at the body of Morrison, then at the sheriff, who was slowly walking toward them. The shotgun now held loosely in one hand. "The law is a slow-moving thing," Sheriff Miller said, his voice heavy, "but it gets there in the end." As the townspeople gathered around, another man pushed his way to the front. It was Mr. Abernathy, the owner of the town's small printing press. He was holding up a freshly printed copy of the Pine Ridge Pioneer, in large, bold letters. The headline read, "Railroad Fraud Exposed." Below it, in smaller type, it said, "Morrison's ledger reveals years of deceit." Abernathy looked at Samuel, then at Elizabeth, and a slow, respectful smile spread across his face. "The truth is out," he said. "The real truth. The whole valley will know by morning." Samuel looked at the newspaper, then at Elizabeth's face, so close to his own. He looked at Tava, and at the sheriff, and at the faces of the townspeople, no longer shadowed by fear. The reign of James Morrison was over, not just ended by a bullet, but dismantled by the truth. The valley could finally breathe again. The silence that followed the gunfight was heavier than the one that had preceded it. It was a silence of reckoning, of a town looking at its own reflection in the dusty street where a tyrant lay dead. The immediate aftermath was a blur of motion and quiet. Urgent work. Dr. Whitman took Samuel to his clinic, his face a mask of professional concern as he cleaned and stitched the deep, ugly wound in Samuel's shoulder. It was a painful, gritty process. And through it all, Elizabeth stayed by his side, her presence a silent, unwavering source of strength. The true work of healing, for the town and for its people, began the next day. Judge Carleton, his authority now absolute and unquestioned, moved with the swift, inexorable force of a river in spring melt. He did not leave town. He convened a formal hearing in the town hall, and his first act was to declare all of James Morrison's assets forfeit to the court. The grand house on the hill, the freighting company, the horses, the wagons, the money in the bank, it was all seized. "A man like Morrison," the judge announced, his voice echoing in the packed room, "builds his empire on the fear and silence of others. This court will not allow that foundation to stand. These assets will be used to create a fund. First, to compensate the ranchers who were intimidated and cheated. Second, to aid the Ute people who were slandered and driven from their lands by this man's greed. What remains will become a community trust for the betterment of Pine Ridge." A wave of stunned, hopeful silence greeted his words. It was a form of justice the people had never imagined, a justice that did not just punish, but rebuilt. The railroad. Seeing its conspiracy laid bare in the pages of the Pine Ridge Pioneer and its most valuable asset in the region now lying in the undertaker's office, moved quickly to distance itself from the scandal. The director, Wallace, was recalled to Denver in disgrace. He was replaced by a quiet, serious man in a plain suit who arrived on the afternoon stage. This new man, Mr. Davies, met with Judge Carleton and the town council. There were no threats, no bluster. He simply unrolled a new map. "The Denver and Rio Grande Railroad," Davies announced in a dry, official tone, "has reevaluated the survey. We have found a more stable, geologically sound route. It will bypass this valley to the north. It will be more expensive," he added, "but the company feels it is a more prudent long-term investment." It was a complete and total surrender. Wrapped in the language of corporate prudence, the iron snake had been turned aside. The Ute Valley was safe. The next day, it was Elizabeth's turn to stand before the judge. She walked to the front of the town hall, not as a witness this time, but as a petitioner. She was no longer wearing borrowed clothes, but a simple gray dress she had bought from the mercantile, a dress of her own choosing. She did not look at the crowd. She looked only at the judge, her gaze clear and direct. "Your Honor," she began, her voice quiet but carrying to every corner of the room. "I am here to request that my marriage to the late James Morrison be annulled." "On what grounds, Mrs. Morrison?" the judge asked gently. "On the grounds that it was a fraudulent contract entered into under false pretenses," she replied, her voice gaining strength, "and on the grounds of cruelty, unlawful imprisonment, and the clear and present attempt on my life, the evidence for which has been witnessed by this entire town. I also wish to reclaim my own name. I am not Mrs. Morrison. I am Elizabeth Turner." The judge looked at her, and a rare, brief smile touched his lips. He picked up his pen, dipped it in the inkwell, and signed the document in front of him with a flourish. "The law recognizes the truth, Miss Turner. Your request is granted. You are a free woman." A few days later, after the initial storm of legal activity had subsided, Tava came for them. He did not come into the town proper, but sent word through Daniel, the livery boy. He asked them to meet him at the edge of the Ute Valley, where the foothills began to rise toward the high peaks. They rode out in the late afternoon, the sun casting long shadows across the snow. Samuel's arm was in a sling, a dull, constant ache, but he sat tall in the saddle. Elizabeth rode beside him, her face calm, her eyes taking in the vast, wild beauty of the landscape as if seeing it for the first time. They found Tava waiting for them in a wide, windy meadow. A small fire burned, its smoke rising straight and thin into the cold, clear air. A dozen or so other Ute men and women stood with him, their faces impassive, but their eyes curious. Tava greeted them with a simple nod. "We have come to give thanks," he said, "not to you, but to the land, which endures, and to the spirits, who gave us the strength to stand. You are welcome to watch." The ceremony was simple and profound. An elder sang a low, rhythmic chant, a song that seemed to be pulled from the earth itself. They made offerings of tobacco and cornmeal to the four directions. There were no grand speeches, no pronouncements of victory. It was a quiet, dignified act of rebalancing, of acknowledging a wrong that had been righted and a harmony that had been restored. When it was over, Tava walked over to Samuel. He held out his hand. In it lay a single, perfect eagle feather, its base wrapped in red cloth and fine beadwork. "This is not a gift for a hero," Tava said, his voice serious. "The eagle does not fly for the praise of men. He flies because it is his nature. He sees the whole world, the hunter and the hunted, the river and the stone. This is a reminder, to always see the whole world, to remember that you stood for the land." Samuel took the feather. He understood. It was not a medal. It was a responsibility. He looked at Tava, and at Elizabeth, and at the vast, silent mountains that ringed the valley. For the first time, he felt the weight of a world larger than his own simple survival, and he did not feel burdened. He felt grounded. As they rode back toward town in the fading light, Elizabeth was quiet. They passed the small office of the Pine Ridge Pioneer. A light was on inside, and Mr. Abernathy was standing in the doorway, as if waiting for them. He held up his latest edition. "I thought you might want to see this," he said, a note of pride in his voice. Samuel took the paper. There, on the front page, below an article detailing the seizure of Morrison's assets, was a second piece, an editorial. It was titled, "Our Neighbors, the Ute." The article spoke of the lies that had been told about the Ute people, of the convenient fictions used to justify theft. It spoke of their dignity, of Tava's courage at the bridge, and of the debt the town owed them. It ended with a simple, powerful sentence. A town is only as strong as the promises it keeps, not just to itself, but to all who share the land. Samuel looked up from the paper, stunned. This was more than just a legal victory. This was a change in the heart of the town. Justice was not just a bright, flashy firework. It was a slow, warm light, spreading from a small printer's shop, powerful enough to chase away the old, cold shadows. Justice was the quiet seed of a new beginning, taking root in the hard, frozen ground. The Chinook winds came in late March, a warm, hungry breath that devoured the snow. The world, which had been locked in white silence for months, began to thaw. The sound of running water returned to the valley, a low, constant murmur of life reawakening. The ice on the creek broke with a sound like distant thunder, and the land began to show its true colors, the deep, rich brown of the earth and the pale green of new grass. For Samuel and Elizabeth, it was the signal to leave. Their departure from Pine Ridge was as quiet as their arrival had been tumultuous. There were no grand farewells. They simply packed their few belongings onto Buck and another horse they had bought, a gentle mare, for Elizabeth. They said their goodbyes to Dr. Whitman, to the blacksmith O'Rourke, and to Daniel, the livery boy, who promised to look after their horses as if they were his own. The townspeople watched them go, their faces filled with a quiet respect. They were no longer a spectacle, a mountain man and a fallen bride. They were simply a part of the valley's new story. They did not go far. Samuel knew of a place, a small, abandoned trapper's cabin nestled in a valley carved by a beaver stream. About a day's ride west of town, it was sheltered by a stand of tall ponderosa pines and looked out onto a wide meadow that sloped down to the water. The cabin was rough. The chinking between the logs had crumbled in places, and the roof had a hole the size of a wagon wheel. But the stone fireplace was sound, and the four walls were solid. It was a place that had been built to last. It was a place to make a home. The weeks that followed were filled with the simple, satisfying rhythm of hard work. They were not building a life from scratch. They were repairing one, mending the broken pieces of the cabin just as they were mending the broken pieces of themselves. Samuel, his shoulder now a healed scar, worked with a quiet, focused energy he had once reserved only for the hunt. He cut and split new logs to patch the walls, his axe ringing in the clean, pine-scented air. He taught Elizabeth how to mix mud and grass for chinking, and they worked side by side, pressing the mixture into the gaps, their hands covered in the rich, dark earth. Their laughter, when it came, was easy and unforced, a sound that belonged in that valley. Together, they climbed onto the roof and repaired the hole, patching it with new shingles Samuel had painstakingly carved. From that high perch, they could see the whole valley laid out before them, a world of green and gold under a vast blue sky. They were not escaping the world. They were claiming their small piece of it. They started a garden in a patch of sun-drenched soil near the cabin. They turned the earth and planted potatoes and beans and squash, their movements a slow, steady dance of creation. And they built a fence. Not a fence to keep the world out, but a simple rail fence to keep the deer from their fledgling garden. The work was hard. Their muscles ached at the end of each day, but it was a good ache, the ache of building something that was theirs. In the evenings, they would sit on the small porch they had built, watching the alpenglow paint the high peaks in shades of pink and orange, listening to the distant, lonely howl of a coyote. It was a sound that no longer spoke of solitude to Samuel, but of the wild, beautiful world that was their home. One afternoon in late spring, when the aspen leaves were the size of a squirrel's ear and the deer were beginning to shed their heavy winter coats, a visitor arrived. Tava appeared at the edge of the forest as silently as he always did, a tall, lean figure who seemed to be a part of the landscape itself. He did not come to the cabin, but waited by the tree line, a sign of respect for their new, private world. Samuel and Elizabeth walked out to meet him. They stood for a moment in comfortable silence. Three people from different worlds, bound by a shared history of violence and survival. "The land is quiet," Tava said, his gaze sweeping over their small homestead. "The iron snake has found another path." "It is," Samuel agreed. "Thanks to you." Tava shook his head. "Not to me, to the truth. The truth is a strong hunter. It always finds its prey in the end." He held out a bundle wrapped in soft deer hide. He had a gift. It was a quiver of 12 arrows. They were beautiful. Deadly things, the shafts straight and true, the arrowheads forged from dark, sharp stone, the fletching made from the feathers of a hawk. "These are for the cabin wall," Tava said, "a reminder that a home is a thing to be defended. If anyone else, man or beast, ever tries to steal the sleep of this land, you will be ready." He placed the quiver in Samuel's hands, his own hand resting on Samuel's shoulder for a brief, powerful moment. It was a gesture of profound farewell. His work here was done. His path led elsewhere, back to his people, back to the high country and the endless winding trails of freedom. He gave a single, solemn nod to Elizabeth, turned, and walked back into the forest, vanishing as completely as if he had been a dream. That evening, a letter arrived. A rider from the mail post in Pine Ridge had been paid to deliver it. It was addressed to Elizabeth Turner, and the postmark was from St. Louis. It was from a wealthy family she had known in her old life, a family who had heard of her troubles and her widowhood. The letter was filled with sympathy and polite condolences, and it contained an offer, a position as a governess for their children, a respectable job, a comfortable home, a return to the safety and civility of the world she had left behind. She read the letter by the light of the fire, her face unreadable. Samuel watched her, his heart a tight knot in his chest. He would not say a word. He would not influence her. He had made a promise to himself that her freedom was the most important thing. This was her choice, and hers alone. She finished reading, and then she looked at him, her eyes clear and calm in the firelight. She did not say anything. She simply folded the letter, rose from her chair, and without any ceremony, dropped it into the heart of the fire. They watched together as the paper curled, blackened, and was consumed by the flames, the words of her old life turning into nothing but ash and smoke. She came and sat on the floor at his feet, leaning her head back against his knees. He ran his fingers through her hair. The silence in the small cabin filled with a deep and abiding peace. Outside, the beaver stream murmured its endless song. A log in the fireplace popped, sending a shower of sparks up the chimney. She tilted her head up to look at him, her face glowing in the warm light. Her expression was soft, happy, and utterly content. She smiled, a slow, beautiful smile that held all the memory of their shared journey, from a snowy street in a hostile town to this quiet, perfect moment. "Do you recognize me, Mountain Man?" she asked. Her voice was not the desperate whisper he had heard in the storm. It was a clear, warm, and joyful sound, as steady and true as the beating of his own heart. He looked down at her, this woman who was both the ghost of his past and the promise of his future, this brave, resilient soul who had faced down her own demons and his, and had chosen this life. With him, the solitary hunter, the man who had run from all attachments, had finally been captured. "I recognize you," he said, his voice thick with a love that was as vast and as wild as the mountains themselves. "You are my home." Thank you for listening to our story. Please comment on where you are listening from so we can all connect and share our thoughts. And be sure to subscribe to my channel, Wild West Tales, like the video, and support further by pressing the hype button so this story in the video can be heard by more people.